So in the winter of 1956, Waiting for Godot made its American premiere at the Coconut Grove Playhouse in Miami, Florida. It was billed as the laugh sensation of two continents, and it starred Bert Lahr, the well-known burlesque and film actor, as Estragon. Here's how the director, Alan Schneider, remembered opening night. Up went the plush gold curtain, and instead of burlesque, that audience got Waiting for Godot, not the laugh sensation of two continents, but a very strange sensation indeed. At first they laughed, but as soon as they realized that the actors were on to more serious matters, they stopped. A few of them started to whisper, a few to groan, more and more of them audibly. Somebody got up to get a drink, somebody else got up muttering, got another drink. By the intermission, at least a third of the audience had left and another third didn't come back afterwards. Okay, so a year later, in November of 1957, Waiting for Godot made its West Coast premiere at a decidedly different venue, the San Quentin Correctional Facility. Here's how one of the actors in the San Francisco Actors Workshop production remembers that audience made up of 1,400 convicts. They liked it. They applauded for a long time. While middle-class audiences were shaking their heads as they snuck out the side door at intermission, at San Quentin, the crowd was making history by contributing some of the first arguably serious analysis of perhaps the single most analyzed play of the 20th century. Godot is society, one convict said. He's the outside, said another. So what conditions allow convicts to go ahead and interpret the play for themselves and for each other when far more sophisticated audiences were left speechless? When Hermes, the messenger god, discovered language and writing and gave it to humans, he invited us to engage in the process of translating our experience and perception into words. In short, he gave us the gift of social interpretation. In homage to Hermes, the Greek word for interpret, hermenou, focuses on the role of language, how we use it to organize our sense of the world by linking words into structures of thought, until at last we have meaning, meaning that can be communicated to others. But do we interpret in order to understand, or is understanding a function of a reflexive, elemental need to make sense of our worlds? Developmental psychologists have long marveled at how children naturally point, wave, and grunt to draw attention to interesting things in their environment. As one developmental psychologist puts it, this might seem like the simplest skill until you realize that no other species does it. By some accounts, this desire to share our thoughts is responsible for what makes us human, including language and our sophisticated culture. Analyzing and articulating the nature of meaning, the message that is intended or expressed or signified, is fundamental to the history of thinking, of course. It's in the Western tradition, this work extends back to Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's On Interpretation, and continues to this day in a range of disciplines from semiotics to philosophy to phenomenology, performance studies, and evolutionary anthropology. In Ellen Disaniaki's recent study of the relationship between art making and the infancy of the human species, for example, she notes that meaning was first located in what felt right: a full stomach, a safe environment, nearness of familiar others, and that over a millennia of human evolution, the mind increasingly became a making sense organ. Sometimes this reflexive making sense process remains a private one. The quiet contemplation of an arts experience is a critical form of interpreting meaning, and the internal processing of meaning is, of course, a part of every receptor's experience. But while internal private meaning making is the reflexive evolutionary starting point, it is not for many people the destination. As I argue in my new book, deep pleasure in arts going can come from what I'm calling social interpretation. That is, audience-produced meaning making that occurs in and through public settings and mechanisms. Which brings me to my inciting question for today's talk. Why don't Americans talk about the serious arts? We talk and we opine about everything else that we consume, from food and wine to sports, television, games, books. Why is it that we shy away from the same kind of engaged meaning making when it comes to the arts? In my book, I use the phrase arts talk as a container for the concept of social interpretation. Arts talk is a metaphor, an ethos, and ultimately a call to arms. It is a metaphor for a way of moving through the world with art as an intimate companion. It's an ethos promoting a set of ideals that characterize an arts-infused community. And it is a call to arms, championing a move beyond the one-way delivery system that characterizes meaning-making in most of the discourse around the serious arts in contemporary America. The arts talk term is meant to imply not just literal talk, but also a spirit of vibrancy and engagement among and between arts goers. I borrow the term calculus here in order to refer to its basic meaning, the study of how things change. So my arts talk calculus is marked by 5 linking operations. An experience combined with taste produces talk, which arouses pleasure, thus engendering engagement. As advertised, I'm going to focus my remarks this afternoon on the producing talk part of this calculus. But before I do, I do want to make a couple of comments about some of the other components of this calculus. An experience, according to John Dewey, is different from experience because an experience is characterized by unity. Dewey says that experiences alone are often inchoate, a kind of drifting without genuine initiation or concludings. One thing replaces another but does not absorb it and carry it on. I think this is a really important distinction. Experiences come and go without reflection and without a sense of consummation. An experience, on the other hand, is characterized by a sense of satisfaction born out of the opportunity to reflect, to analyze, to understand, and to move towards consummation. Taste. I don't think it's by accident that the English word taste refers to both our gustatory sense and to a sociocultural process. Both usages have their roots in the Latin taxere, meaning to evaluate or to handle. Defining one's aesthetic taste is a complicated process that cannot be reduced to immediate sensation, whether physiological or emotional. Personal taste in everything from beer to Shakespeare comes through a combination of biology, past experience, cultural norms, and individual predilection. We're born into our tastes, we're socialized into our tastes, and we, to some extent, choose our tastes. Pleasure. Theories of pleasure abound. They're produced by estheticians, moral philosophers, neurobiologists, cognitive psychologists, and cartoonists. I had to choose this because of the Chicago pizza, you know. Although I think my favorite part is the failure of others. Look how big it is, you know, and the font. That's great. Biologically speaking, the sensation of pleasure comes from what brain scientists now identify as a distributed system of the cortical and subcortical regions, whose major components include liking, wanting, and learning, with learning defined as associations, representations, and predictions about future rewards based on past experience. The latter point aligns with Aristotle. who wrote in the Poetics that learning is most pleasant, not only to philosophers, but to others as well. All people, he wrote, delight in learning and reasoning out what each thing is. So when I use the word pleasure in reference to audience experience, I don't mean comfort or ease, but rather the deep satisfaction that comes from working something through. Because what can be more satisfying than processing an opinion about the things that interest us, especially art? And what can be more pleasurable for me as an audience member than experiencing a work of art not as a product with fixed meaning, but rather as a process of meaning making that's dependent on my participation? And how satisfying to share that process with others. The word engagement is derived from the action of gears built into a mechanism. When the gears engage, the mechanism gets to work. Emotionally and intellectually, people engage when they involve themselves in a process of some sort, when they have the sense that they too are an element in what makes the thing work. An engaged classroom, for example, is one in which students are authentic learners. That is, they have been charged with and accept responsibility for their own learning process. The term audience engagement is often employed in the arts industry in reference to what happens to the audience while in the act of consuming a work of art. That's generally the focus of the term engagement. But that's distinct from what I mean by engagement. I'm talking about the idea that arts talk as a construct is predicated on the focusing on the most significant opportunities for engendering engagement, and that they come before and after the arts event, and they offer the audience the opportunity to formulate and to express an opinion, and in a social context. We'll come back to this slide at the end of the talk and look at it a little bit more carefully. So the formulation aspect of the meaning-making process can come through a variety of activities. I use the term paratext to describe them. I borrow it from Jonathan Gray, who himself borrows it from the literary theorist Gerard Genette. And what he means by that, and what I mean by it, are the cultural materials and activities that surround an event or an arts object. Paratexts are part of the meaning-making structure. They give audiences the resources to talk about the subjects at hand and the tools to interpret its meaning. The expression part of the meaning-making process comes through talking. Evolutionarily speaking, human beings talk in order to get what they want. I mean, even seemingly aimless social conversation like, "How are you?" is not meaningless. It's a gesture intended to acknowledge another person's presence. Most people talk out of the urge to share their feelings, ideas, and reactions to something they've recently undergone. Talking is a way of processing experience. But it's also a mechanism for formulating an opinion about that experience. Talking facilitates the human need and desire to make meaning. As linguist Ronald Wardbaugh notes, language helps us to work out what we are feeling, what we are doing, how we are doing it, and how we must seem to be doing whatever we are doing. We not only observe others and their language and behavior, we also observe ourselves, our own acting, doing, behaving, and talking, all through this mechanism of language. But why use the word talk? Why have I chosen talk instead of conversation or dialogue or even debate or discussion? By employing the word talk, I'm purposefully signaling an attitude and I hope an attendant methodology based on open access and cultural availability. So I go to where it's used all the time. Arts talk should be as common and as democratic as sports talk. Our societal goal should be to construct an interpretive culture about arts going that feels ordinary and familiar and whose boundaries are permeable and expansive. You notice that many of these sports talk activities are actually paratextual. They surround the sporting event, and they offer sports fans a way of viewing and thinking about and preparing for the event itself. Most importantly, they offer sports fans the opportunity to engage in productive talk. So I define productive talk as talk that communicates about a specific topic, airs publicly a range of opinions and perspectives on that topic, listens and considers other points of view, and works toward both collective and individual meaning making. And this definition of productive talk holds true whether the talk is physical, co-present, or whether it's virtual and digital. Productive talk can take the form of dialogue, what David Bohm, the author of the widely admired On Dialogue, defines as a method of achieving a shared appreciation of multiple meanings, out of which he stresses truth emerges unannounced. For Bohm, the picture or image that this derivation suggests is of a stream of meaning flowing among and through us and between us. This will make possible a flow of meaning in the whole group, out of which may emerge some new understanding. Bohm's definition of truth, something new that arrives from listening and observing, I think is extremely appealing in an arts context. Because if we can share in the expression of various meanings, we may find that talk surrounding an arts event is both fundamentally more democratic and more interesting. But in a robust arts ecology, there has to be room for a good argument. We need both heated discussion and rigorous debate. Both terms imply a battle over territory as individual perspectives and opinions are presented and defended. I envision an arts experience where discussion and debate are as at home as they are in the sports experience or in the wide variety of productive talk that surrounds other types of cultural consumption. That's why we like sports and TV and restaurants and movies, because we know how to debate their value, and we enjoy the rush of adrenaline that comes from arguing in a democratic fashion. I would say, though, that the majority of contemporary Americans do not equate attending the serious arts with this kind of adrenaline release. But, as we're about to see, our European forebears most certainly did. In the Western tradition, before the 20th century, most arts environments were open to public interpretation because the arts event itself was a form of community property. The function of interpretation was understood as both a cultural duty and a cultural right. The art object or event's meaning could be discerned through a thorough interpretive process, which by definition included the audience's perspective. This is a period engraving depicting the behavior in the Surrey Theatre in London in the late 18th century. And you can see that as you go up the tiers, the physicalized responses get more and more pronounced. By definition, this notion of engagement included the audience's perspective. But this doesn't imply, of course, that there was regular or even consistent consensus in the process or the protocol of interpretation. I mean, the history of arts reception is full of vivid examples of the violent ways in which artists and producers and audiences disagreed. But that's just the point. Art did not arrive with a fixed meaning. Rather, it was received by the audience as an inherently flexible commodity yielding ever-changing interpretations. Up until the end of the 19th century, an arts experience was a form of cultural capital negotiated largely through a wide array of public, internal, and back-channel discourses. So I'm going to show you a few slides that come from period drawings, civic documents, newspapers, but we also get our evidence from memoirs, police records, and sometimes the arts works themselves, which draw pretty vivid illustrations of audience agency. So here's an image of the audience at the theater, and you can see that the pit audience is seated at tables, they're eating, they're talking to each other, and not paying total, complete, silent, reverent attention to the actor there behind the footlights. This is a period drawing of the opera box at the Paris Opera in the 17th century, and we can see what the real focus of the entertainment was. This is a period drawing of a production inside a tennis court. Tennis courts were used very commonly beginning in the 16th century in England and on the continent to stage theater performances, and they had the atmosphere of a tennis court. They retained that. This is an engraving, an 18th century production of the Comédie Italienne in Paris. It's outdoors, and what I like about this slide is the way in which you can see people moving their seats to accommodate whatever it is they're interested in. Some of them are playing cards, some of them are eating, some of them are watching the performance and moving closer to get a better view. This is a period drawing of the premiere of John Gay's The Beggar's Opera in 1728. And what's fascinating about this is these are the actors. I think that's Polly. I think that's McHeath. And this is the action going on in the world of the play. These people and those people are audience members. Seated on stage, these were the expensive tickets. It was very common, and it was a slow process in England and on the continent to sort of ban the audience from the stage. And we have records of audiences being seated on stage up into the 19th century and the kind of calamities that go along with it. A lot of good stories. And then finally, here's a picture of the Comédie Française. A couple of things to note here. One, this is the pit, and the audience is standing in the pit. Two, just as a reminder, you don't have the lights going out because you have candelabras and later gas lighting, very difficult to turn on and off, and so the house remains lit. This is true until 1881. Historians theorize that these guys here are not actors peeking out. They're actually audience members looking for their friends, right? So it's sort of another indication of that world, which is clearly very different than ours. So it's important to note that this kind of sort of social, this physicalized agency that resulted in a lot of talk, that resulted in a good deal of social interpretation, happened both inside and outside the arts venue. I write at length about both types in my book, and the stories I tell illustrate the ways in which Western audiences, up until the end of the 19th century, exercised a kind of agency over their own experience with the arts. The stories also reveal how seriously audiences of the past took the aesthetic elements of their art going. So we can look at this as far back as the ancient Greeks. During the golden era of the 5th century, the theater of Dionysus was reportedly a noisy space where the audience took its play going seriously and did it in a vivid and verbal way, and particularly in regards to the aesthetic characteristics. Aristotle claims that a 5th century playwright named Agathon failed to secure a win at the annual Best Tragedy contest because the audience felt that he had crowded too many events into a single plot. I find that really fascinating, this notion that collectively the audience would weigh in on something as purely aesthetic as the building of a plot. At the Comédie Française in 1711, a spectator interrupted the actors on stage while they were performing Racine's Britannicus to question the classical sources of the play. When the actors refused to engage in a critique of Racine, a brawl broke out. The cultural historian Jeffrey Ravel uses this as an example of this extraordinary agency in a space that was created by the king for the aristocracy, but that commoners could attend, that just a few decades after the Comédie Française was established as the state theater, this commoner felt the kind of sovereignty over his experience that allowed him to weigh in that fashion. Now, this happened in the United States as well. At the Pittsburgh Theater in the early 1830s, concerns over the level of acting prompted the audience to hiss the theater manager off the stage during a curtain speech. They were mad because they felt that he brought in third-rate actors to the Pittsburgh Theater, which he managed, while saving his best actors for the Philadelphia Theater that he managed. And this made its way into the social conversation about the theater's operations. And at the Astor Place Theater in Lower Manhattan in 1849, 31 people were killed and 150 injured as the result of an argument over who was the better actor, the American-born Edwin Forrest or the English-born William Macready. Now, this is a true event and quite an astonishing one. And obviously there was much more to it than just this argument over who was the better Shakespearean actor. And a lot of socio-political tension going on in Jacksonian American. But it's fascinating that it takes its form in this conversation about acting and acting style. These are examples of social interpretation inside the arts venue. But now I want to move on to examples of social interpretation that occurred regularly outside the arts venue. So not while you're watching the performance, but in everyday life. These early iterations of water cooler chats took shape in a variety of forms of talk, from animated debates in coffee houses to street-level gossip, to arguments waged in arts appreciation clubs managed by and for the audience members themselves. They occurred in 17th century French salons. Supposedly, these people were debating Molière. They occurred in coffee houses of 18th century London, where patrons regularly mingled with artists to talk about the merits of what was going on stage. And they occurred in early 19th century Venice, where a production, if it failed to please the audience, would form the constant topic of conversation, criticism, and general observation in the streets, in shops, and private gatherings. So what does that sound like? It sounds like contemporary sports talk, right? These arts events drew the attention of the public outside of the venue, and they fueled everyday conversation long after the performances were over. Now, while cultural gatekeepers certainly existed throughout this period, they didn't have the authority to regulate community discourse. So the question is why? And perhaps it's because this was an environment where arts talk was a normal commodity of daily cultural commerce, much in the same way that sports talk is a normal commodity of our daily exchanges. The level of the public's influence on the interpretive function is also marked by the formation of audience-centered musical societies, arts appreciation clubs, drama leagues, and other membership-driven organizations gathering to create art, to present professional artists, and to share in a dialogue about the value and meaning of the arts in their communities. My favorite example of this is the phenomenon of drama leagues in the United States. And they happened all over the country. There was a formal organization called the Drama League of America. And what they did was they brought patrons of the theater together in various different cities. The leagues were run by audience members, and they existed in order to provide outlets for the audience members to talk about the plays that were coming to town, talk about performances, but also to write and disseminate their own reviews. So this is an example of the Pittsburgh chapter. It's from 1921. The Provincetown Players came to Pittsburgh. They did a production of The Emperor Jones, and this is cut off, so this isn't the whole thing. But this is a review written by an audience member for other audience members. And importantly, what you can't see at the bottom of this is a note that says, this official statement of the Drama League is independent of any outside influence. And the idea here is that they were clear about the fact that they were independent of the role of reviewers, newspaper reviewers, of arts industry officials and other gatekeepers who were normally in charge of making meaning, and certainly in terms of evaluating the aesthetic value. These and many other stories from my book underline the fact that historical audiences felt authorized to comment on aesthetic matters, and they point to how important the free expression of that commentary was to their sense of citizenship. So given this hermeneutically rich history of arts going and audience behavior, what happened? Why did the American audience lose access to the public construction of meaning? Audience sovereignty over the American arts-going experience began disappearing in the second half of the 19th century, when discrete but complementary factions of intellectuals, artists, wealthy patrons, and religious officials initiated deliberate efforts to create a cultural hierarchy. The corresponding concept of culture with a capital C was borrowed from the British critic and poet Matthew Arnold, and put into place as a tool to compete with Europe's assumed cultural superiority. In his groundbreaking study, Highbrow, Lowbrow, Lawrence Levine calls this shift the sacralization of culture. And he traces a complicated path from audience sovereignty to arts industry sovereignty. Much of this social engineering was organized around efforts to control the corporeal presence of American audiences in the arts venue. So for example, in the 1880s, the Keith Albee chain of popular priced vaudeville palaces began restricting audience behavior inside the venue. That's the Boston Opera House, and it was one of the Keith Albee, it was the original Keith Albee Theater. So signs went up on the walls and flyers were distributed with messages like this. And it was basically an arts etiquette campaign to shift the way in which audiences use their bodies to respond to the work while in the theater. So this is in the popular vaudeville houses. But this campaign also existed in more elite institutions. This is an early Harper's drawing of visitors in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the early 1890s, the director of the museum boasted to a newspaper reporter that he had ended the display of offending personal habits of the working class visitors to the museum. Under his tight control, he proclaimed, there was no more whistling, singing, or calling aloud to people from one gallery to another. There are really great stories about, the Met resisted, it was a closed corporation, and they resisted opening to the public for a long time. And when they did, the public arrived in the same way that they had been accustomed to going to Barnum's American Museum in Lower Manhattan, with picnic baskets, dogs, and the whole family. And this of course, caused a great deal of tension, and there's great stories about it. It was also true at the Metropolitan Opera House. The Opera House, Opera Box residents were quite accustomed to talking, eating, playing cards, and in other ways interacting with each other during the performances. And that was normal. That was understood to be a normal component of the theater going or the opera going experience. But in 1891, the management at the Met began placing notices in the opera boxes requesting that some of the city's richest families stop talking during the performances. So it was a fascinating re-education process. And we have a similar storyline from the evolution of the symphony orchestra industry, led by conductors defending both their artistic rights and the sacred nature of orchestral music. American symphony orchestras started promoting their what they called divine appointment in the mid-19th century. They ended the long-standing practice of mixed programming in which popular music was played along with orchestral scores because, as Levine states, the urge to deprecate popular musical genres was an important element in the process of sacralization. So, in other words, it was common for a symphony orchestra to do both orchestral music and popular music as part of the performances. This is a period drawing from an English newspaper from 1850. I love it because it gives you a sense of how physically active an audience was for a symphonic performance, something that really, I think, surprises people. So I think it's easy to understand why arts workers would promote sacralization and its behavioral accommodations. But why would American audiences, bred on this notion of asserting control, give in to it? Why would they be motivated to agree? One theory points to the rise of the professional class in large U.S. cities, which brought with it calls for self-cultivation. That was the term that was used. And it was an aspect of progressive era social reform centered on the ideal of reason over emotion. The self-cultivation movement eventually came to encompass many aspects of American middle-class life, including personal hygiene, dress reform, and sex education, which was euphemistically referred to as self-knowledge. I took this picture with my phone. I have this book in my collection, and it's fascinating, as you can imagine. The ideal of self-control over personal emotions also extended to the realm of the arts and to audience behavior. As one historian puts it, one had to learn to respond with studious thought rather than spontaneous feeling to music, art, and ideas. About the same time, a new generation of newspaper critics took on the role of evaluating both the cultural and aesthetic value of the arts. And chief among their self-appointed duties was the dissemination of the rules of behavior, which were reframed as arts etiquette, and the dissemination of the rules of taste, which was reframed as aesthetics. So this is a headline from the New York Times in 1904, and you can see what it does. It correlates the intelligent playgoer with someone who will go to see a show even though it's not financially successful. In other words, it's not publicly or widely commercial in its nature. So this was sort of part of the critic's job to help the intelligent playgoer understand what his or her role is. And there were other factors that played into the sacralization process. This includes the invention of the incandescent lamp. 1881, the Savoy Theatre in London is the first public building in the world to be lit entirely by electricity. So to keep that in perspective, prior to that time, the audience is lit, sometimes as equally lit as the performers. After the invention of the incandescent lamp, very quickly the houses were darkened. The audience is in a dark environment, and the whole push for silence and stillness is made much easier through this technological shift. I would argue that another firming up of the sacralization process happened after World War II, when the charitable not-for-profit tax status was firmed up. And this gave us the kind of very clear demarcation between the serious arts, theater, opera, ballet, and entertainment. And that remains with us to this day. With all of these changes, the audience moved a step further away from the kind of interpretive agency that fueled 2,000 years of arts talk in Western culture. Instead of being invited into an active and robust hermeneutic environment, 20th century audiences were trained in how best to contribute to the perfect environment for the presentation of the art event or the art object, which meant being quiet and still. But most importantly, instead of being encouraged to form and voice an opinion about the meaning and value of the arts they attended, 20th century audiences were encouraged to yield to the experts. And gradually, the idea that the arts-going experience might also include discussion and debate about the meaning and value of the arts event faded away. For the average white middle-class professional, it was enough to be appropriately dressed, politely present, and to know you're not supposed to clap between movements, even though that was a 20th century invention and clapping between movements was common, as Greg Sandow in his blog, The Future of Classical Music, has amply demonstrated for us. That was then. Today, we have clearly moved into a different construct. And cultural vitality, defined by the sheer pleasure of making meaning and ascribing value, has been powered by a multicultural, postmodern, post-analog ethos that challenges 20th century notions of hierarchical gatekeeping and rules of taste defined by white Eurocentric cultural traditions. This cultural turn is spurred on by a wave of do-it-yourself social energy and a wide array of digitally powered engines that have helped to engender a sense of ownership in cultural practices ranging from science to politics to journalism. The live plus digital transformation has delivered us into a world where we expect to be able to participate in meaningful ways in a wide range of activities that analog generations received passively, including meaning making. In chapter 3 of my book, I explore the role that live and digital talk plays in the interpretation of a lot of cultural industries, sports and gaming, but also new media practices like social television. So, lots of examples of social interpretation built into the construct of the digital application. And social reading, again, very interesting applications here. Inviting audiences into this social construction of meaning. And in the second part of my book, I devote considerable space to describing strategies for engineering what I call arts learning communities and facilitating productive talk about our arts-going experiences. My goal is twofold: to encourage arts workers to see public meaning making as part of the art making and art delivery systems, and two, to help arts workers build a culture of productive talk in their organizations and in their communities. I think these goals relate very nicely to Betty's latest book and the concept of relational motivation. That's a strategy for building respect and appreciation with the organization and the audiences working together. So that relational component is clearly an emerging and very important context. All right, I'm going to finish where I began. According to several accounts, the San Quentin inmates' experience of waiting for Godot began with a curtain speech delivered by Herbert Blau, the show's director. Blau started by comparing the play to a piece of jazz music, to which one must listen for whatever one may find in it. He then said he hoped that each inmate would find some meaning, some personal significance. And with that sincere invitation to enter into the interpretive process, the San Quentin inmates didn't hesitate to turn that art event, the production of Waiting for Godot, into an arts experience whose meaning they had every right to interpret for themselves and with each other. They went ahead and made sense of their world, a world filled with waiting and with disappointment, by making a connection with the fate of Didi and Gogo. I believe that all audiences want to be engaged in the process of making sense of their worlds through the connection with art, and I also believe that they want to be invited to do so. So that finishes my formal remarks. And I thought you might want, not Walt Whitman finishes my formal remarks. Isn't that a beautiful quote? And I thought you might want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on right now that really demonstrate this ideal of social interpretation, although they're not using that term. And I sort of pointed to some Chicago-based activities that do that. So, you have paratextual activities like the Beyond the Score at the Chicago Symphony, which doesn't, to my understanding, invite active social interpretation, but it provides the kind of learning process that allows that to occur. You have video essays at Silk Road Rising, where they're producing conversation about the work that they do, which is accessible online. You have the free speech forums in Minneapolis at the Mixed Blood Theater, where it's a combination of events, including audience or talkbacks. They used to be called talkbacks, but they're led by the audience and they're controlled by the audience. So the notion of free speech is moving into this social interpretation realm. The iCritic booth is at the Barrington Stage Company in the Berkshires, and they have a booth. You can go in, you record your review, your feelings, and then they get uploaded to a YouTube channel, and it's very successful for a lot of reasons. Steppenwolf's First Look 101, which I'm sure you all know about. And that program clearly is inviting people to look under the hood, to think about the way in which new plays are developed, and then offering opportunities for the audience to weigh in on how they think that went and what its value is, both in terms of aesthetics and in terms of the political context as well. So at this point, I'd be really happy to have a conversation and get your thoughts and reactions and skepticisms.
I'm interested to hear a little bit about if you've presented this to the traditional arts organizations and what you've heard from them.
Yeah. I first started talking about these ideas prior to doing the work with the Heinz Endowments in the early 2000s. And there was lots of pushback because it challenges a lot of sacred ideas about who makes meaning, what it takes to make meaning in the arts, and why it's important that only appropriately trained gatekeepers are allowed to do that. And that conversation continues to this day. I think what's interesting about that is I'm not challenging the value of the well-trained gatekeeper. I'm a college professor. I'm a well-trained gatekeeper. My livelihood depends on that being understood as valuable. What I'm saying is that in other constructs in which the audience is fully engaged, there's more than just the gatekeepers in the position to interpret and to offer meaning making. And there's something amiss, something went off the rails in the way in which the arts industry evolved in the United States over the course of the 20th century to put us in this position where we don't have a conversation with the audience, and now we don't know how to have a conversation with the audience. So I think, yes, there's plenty of resistance. But it's also been my experience, as it was in the Arts Experience Initiative project with the Heinz Endowments in Pittsburgh, that once I got talking to board members and artistic directors and executive directors, and once we started really investigating projects, people changed their ideas. They began to see that this wasn't a challenge to their authority, but rather it was an invitation to have a genuine, authentic conversation with people. And the most important thing that I continually have to stress and am planning on taking on in my blog very shortly is the idea, there's a kind of reflexive response in the arts industry that if you talk to the audience about what they like and why they like it, then you have to do what they like and that's it. Like there's this automatic equation. And clearly, that's not the case in other industries. I mean, David Chase didn't change the plot of The Sopranos because The Sopranos was in a conversation with its audience. The sports industry does not change its operations because it is in this very deep and committed conversation with this audience. And we don't need to change what we do either. I mean, I would argue that if you were in an authentic conversation with your audience about meaning and value, that spurs people, like Aristotle said, to a kind of pleasure that would make them more interested in harder things, right? So if you are able to talk through, the next time you might try something that's even more challenging instead of saying, oh, I only want the less challenging things. So, yeah, David.
Thank you, Lynne. This is great. I just wanted to ask about how you think about television, movies, popular music, which is very much in public conversation, where audiences and music and other forms, where there's lots of engagement in all of this, and where these are widely accessible to people, where you're focused on a set of art that has seemingly deliberately been kept from large groups of people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about art. There's not a lot of talk about some of the forms of art that you're talking about.
That's right.
And so how do you think about that?
Well, I hope that the sort of central ethos of this notion of arts talk that I've launched with this book, I hope that that's going to get arts organizations in the so-called serious arts realm to think about the ways in which organizationally they can begin thinking differently and thus acting differently, and how that might loosen up and open up the relationship with the larger community. We're not going to turn opera into the most popular thing in the United States, and I don't think that's the goal, and I don't think that should be the goal. And I certainly don't think that having a butts and seats mentality, a marketing mentality, is not at all what I'm talking about here. But I do think that if audiences, and I know there's plenty of evidence in the kinds of programming and experimentation that's going on, if audiences feel like they're actually wanted, like their opinion is valued, they are far more likely to attend. And there's good documentation of that. Jennifer is responsible for some of that, you know, and there will continue to be. These are small changes, but they're important ones. And even if they don't radically increase the numbers of people who attend the serious arts, they hopefully change the way we talk and think about them culturally. So I think it's very important. And we are in a critical, we're in the ICU. And a lot of our institutions are not going to survive this cultural turn, this digital turn, and this sort of, do-it-yourself turn if we don't change. Yeah. Okay.
You mentioned the notion of cultural duty towards interpretation early on. And it seems that sports and popular music and things that do have a lot of talk surrounding them, do you think that is, sports specifically, because it's so, I guess, locally centralized? Like, you have a duty to support the Yankees from New York.
Yeah, right. Yeah, competition is an interesting aspect of it. And I've been using sports as the analogy for a long time, and that's one of the things that's routinely brought up for good reason, right? Competition definitely spurs something different inside of us. Although I do like to point out that the theater of Dionysus and the plays of the great 5th century playwrights were done in a competitive tribal environment, so people were competing. So that is different. But because things are different doesn't mean we can't extrapolate the things that will work for different communities, you know? So I just encourage people to think about it like that, competition is one kind of energy, but a compelling storyline that you want to follow through, a beautifully sung aria, these things are also deeply compelling and deeply motivating, I think, yeah. In terms of the local level of it, one of the things that that people engaged in this work are trying to do is to figure out, well, how do we make our space, which might not have anything to do specifically with Chicago, like the Chicago Symphony. Okay, so we're not here to just just perform works by Chicago playwrights. But what about the building? Can the building be a space that the community can use in ways other than simply coming in, staying for 2 hours, and leaving? And that's happening all over the place. There are just many, many examples of that, where the building becomes an open space that people use in ways that they choose to. And data shows that a lot of those people, maybe not a lot, but a significant portion of those people invited into the space for a dance party or some kind of social activity because they live in the neighborhood, don't end up coming to see the shows, but they end up feeling a whole lot better about that space, and they don't think of it as a place that they don't belong. And there is something important in that idea, the placemaking construct that the NEA supports and that comes from architecture and from work in urban planning. That clearly has a useful outcome in terms of creating the idea that art is not a palace, that it's not sacred, and that it is something that can be open and accessible to more people. If that leads eventually to a generation that feels welcome in the building and then decides to try out the product, that would be worth the exercise, I think. But I think it's worth the exercise even if they don't come as audience members, personally. Sorry, Betty.
I'm looking at this chart, and I really appreciate the analogy that you've drawn with sports. I think because I've drawn from your work and used that, and it resonates with a lot of people to kind of make this connection. And one of the things about the sports talk and the amateur engagement in sports, there's that audience is clearly still, the fact that they're engaging in other ways doesn't mean that they're not avid fans of professional sports watching as spectators, right? So there's a real bridge between all the stuff that's going on, which I think is your point.
Yeah.
When I look at this chart, I think, well, maybe what we're getting, and maybe it's just a stage in the process, but we're getting a lot of opportunities, some of them digital opportunities, to participate, to talk, to engage with what feel like peers, so that the critics aren't necessarily there.
Right.
But the hope is that that will create a bridge to the professional arts, right?
That's
and
right.
I think that's certainly the professional arts organizations are hoping that. If you're more engaged, are you likely to buy tickets and come? But I know some of Jennifer's work relates to that, about, in certain, is it dance or not dance? There's one of the modes of arts participation where people who actually do it also attend, and I don't remember which one that is.
Dancers do everything.
Dancers do it.
They watch it on TV.
Okay, so they're engaged in every way, but not across the arts, and I think visual artists don't necessarily go to museums.
Right.
So building that bridge, is it something that arts organizations themselves may have to change their, as you were just saying, the meaning of spaces and the use of space, to make it something that people want to do, go sit in seats and be audience attenders?
Yeah, I think so, and I think there are all of these different strategies for doing that that include opening the space up, making it feel like a community space, making the place fun, like, so you can go to, now you go to Joe's Pub and you hang out, and you may not go to the New York Public Theater, but you like that space and you're in it. But my focus is really on engendering this kind of talk, this productive talk about the arts for audience members who are going. Because I think that that is a real missing link. And I think that it's something that we, as institutions, we've lost the infrastructure to facilitate, because people come in, they watch, and they go. And that, as I demonstrated in the talk, it's a kind of an ethos. We don't want to know what they think because they might say the wrong thing. And we know what the right thing is. Like, the sports industry doesn't worry about if their fans say the wrong thing. And when you have a critical mass of talk, you don't have to worry about it, do you? But we're so rarefied in our talk about it. So that's been my focus, and that's definitely the focus of the book, is trying to get arts organizations to think about how they can engender that kind of productive talk, or what their responsibility is to productive talk around the arts, whether they're actively strategizing about it, or whether they're collaborating with other community organizations like colleges and universities to help that conversation become more lively and more accessible. I think it's really hard, and I think the reason why people resist that aspect of the calculus that I lay out, is because it's the hardest thing to do, right? Facilitating a conversation about meaning and value is really difficult. Yeah. So my book has 2 big chapters devoted to strategies for doing that. And hopefully that will help. Yeah.
You previously made I think it's my quote of your session, we're in the ICU, comment that many organizations are really are going to survive this sea change of the do-it-yourself era, digital era, what all that brings. And as you mentioned, you're focused on the meaning making for those who are attending. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, from your perspective, what does it mean for people's involvement in doing? Because some of the examples that you showed, I'm trying to parse out, or can it be parsed in terms of the act of engaging with peers meaning making versus I want to do something and produce something. Not necessarily interpret, but actually do it. Yeah. And just if you have a commentary on that, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that doing is meaning making, right? So that the act of making something is in itself an interpretive function. But it's clear, we have plenty of data that shows that when people have experience with something, they're more likely to feel that they have the sort of authority to look at the professional version of it and make some connections. But it's not necessary to do in order to interpret, right? That seems clear as well. A lot of the paratextual activities do involve art-making projects, and I think that they end up working very nicely to encourage people to feel more at ease with talking about the professional arts. And there are lots of examples. The Heinz Endowments Project had a bunch of them. There was a wonderful project at a photography gallery called the Silver Eye in Pittsburgh, where a group of people came in, they committed to a workshop series. I think it was about 8 sessions, 1 night a week. And they first looked at the exhibit that was up, and then they began writing poetry. There was a poet there who helped them to sort of enter into the world of poetry writing. And they wrote poetry in response to being in the gallery, not necessarily in response to that photo or this photo, but just being there. And the result of that was that people were pretty excited about becoming poets on some level, but they were also much more at ease with the conversation about photography in general. And these were truly lay people. These were not artists. There was a nurse, a social worker, etc. So I think it all works together. And one of the things that I like to stress is that we're always looking for monolithic solutions. It's human nature, right? And in the arts industry, we've really been guilty of that in a lot of ways. This is the fix-it thing, and this is the best practice, or this is the set of 3 best practices, and then we're going to follow these. And we're not going to engage the whole organization with it. We're just going to make the education department follow these, and everybody else is going to do what they've done forever, and then it's going to fix it, and it doesn't. And we know that. And this has been going on for a long time now. None of these things are monolithic. This is all about starting with changing an attitude and having the desire to actually be in conversation and to see audience members as subjects rather than objects, and stop seeing them as wallets. And I think that's very difficult, because that's asking a lot of powerful people to change the way they do their jobs. And that's a big ask. Yeah.
What do you think, could you expand on what you think accounts for that change in attitude in the first place? It's one thing to fail to stand up in front of your audience, like your example of Waiting for Godot at the performance of the Prism, and invite them in. But it's another thing, and kind of takes a lot of gall to put a placard in the box seats of the opera saying, please, our best patrons, please stop talking and sit down and face forward.
It does.
How did we get to the point where we were comfortable doing that, or they were comfortable putting up signs like that?
Yeah, and I think it's very complicated. I highly recommend Lawrence Levine's book, Highbrow, Lowbrow. He does this brilliant job of articulating this sacralization process and the wide array of sociocultural trends and tensions and stresses that really push that forward. And you're right, it takes a lot of gall. I mean, those people built that opera house literally with their funds, Those boxes were their boxes, So, I mean, it's a complicated recipe for bringing it about. But it has to do with America's sense of inferiority, in terms of its cultural sophistication. There's a lot of discussion in the literature about the post-Civil War period, which was the period where New York became the center of culture, and where the kind of new money, as it grew out of the Robert Barron era, was organized around cultural activities, largely in order to get up to snuff, right, so that you could compete. So that's part of the explanation. Part of the explanation is the fear of the body, the corporeal fear and anxiety that Americans have, which we have to this day, and there's plenty of literature about that as well, really interesting stuff. So, the physicalized body inside the art temple was a rub. It didn't go, right? If the art is sacred and you've got people stomping and yelling, and these things make us uncomfortable, right? So that was part of it as well. And then I really do think the not-for-profit paradigm shift with the Ford Foundation initiative in the late 50s also is really a big player in this factor as well, where, so now we're not for profit. Now we have a structure of charitable giving to support us. We don't have to fight the commercial battle. This is really good, and it was really good for the American arts ecology. But it also forced the rhetoric to kind of distinguish itself, right? So now we're special and we're rare and we're sacred, and you middle-class people may or may not belong here, was sort of the attendant message that goes along with it. Yeah. And you working-class people definitely don't belong here, right? Yeah.
So do you think it's going to be possible to rewrite Levine's book in a few years? Are we shifting back to what once was? I mean, this system is grounded, and I'm well aware of many of those challenges, but Is the pendulum moving back in the other direction, given all of the sociocultural, demographic changes that we're experiencing? Your conversations about art talk, or conversations about the doing, art being thought of more broadly than just what's in the temples.
Are we changing?
Yeah, is the next book?
Yeah, we'll see. You have to run the data for me first before. I don't know, actually. I wonder a little bit about it. Now I'll say something really heretical. Part of what will account for this change is the disappearance of a certain manner of institutionalization. So very large organizations with incredibly high overhead to maintain it, those are going to go away. Those are going to have to go away. And what takes its place? Something will. Art will not go away. There is no society without art, and we have all the data we need to prove that. That will not go away. But how we construct it, how we position it societally, and how we think about it in terms of our basic citizenry, that I think could change, and some of it should change. You know? Don't tell that I said that.
I think we probably have to end here.
Yeah, out of time. Thank you. Thank you very much.